Politicians love to talk about oil. Drill, drill, drill. Energy independence cutting reliance on foreign oil. For years, most Americans assumed the country was simply running out, that the world had maybe 35 years of oil left, and the United States was desperately scraping the bottom of the barrel. That assumption could not be more wrong. In the 10 years after 2008, the United States more than doubled its oil production and reclaimed its spot as the single largest oil producer on the planet. But here is the strange part nobody explains. The United States now sends away nearly 1/3 of the oil it pulls out of the ground, just to swap it for oil coming in from somewhere else. This is the story of America's improbable oil revolution, and why, even after all of it, true energy independence still does not exist, and probably never will in the way most people imagine it. To understand America's relationship with oil, you need a quick history lesson first. For most of the last 150 years, the United States was the place the world came to get oil. American wells produced the overwhelming majority of global supply, and Americans also burned through more oil than anyone else on Earth, powering an entire century of industrial growth, suburban expansion, and highway construction that reshaped the physical geography of the country. Then, in the late 1930s, countries like Saudi Arabia and several other nations across the Middle East discovered they were sitting on staggering reserves of their own, and they began drilling aggressively, backed by Western oil companies eager to secure long-term access to what would eventually prove to be some of the largest conventional oil fields ever discovered. Around this same period, the United States started importing small amounts of oil, though domestic wells still covered most of the country's needs, and nobody in Washington was particularly worried about where the remaining supply came from. America's appetite for oil, however, could not be contained. Airplanes, trains, and automobiles multiplied faster than domestic wells could keep pace, and the interstate highway system, along with the rapid post-war boom in car ownership, pushed national demand upward year after year. Demand began outpacing production by a significant margin, and imports filled the gap, growing quietly in the background, while most Americans focused on cheap gasoline rather than where it originated. The country grew steadily more dependent on foreign supply with each passing year, a dependence that felt harmless right up until it suddenly was not. In 1973, following American financial support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, Saudi Arabia and several allied Arab oil exporters retaliated by cutting off exports to the United States entirely. Imports collapsed almost overnight, and domestic production simply could not fill that enormous hole. Gas stations across the country ran completely dry. Long lines formed at empty pumps, sometimes stretching for blocks, with drivers waiting hours only to be turned away once the tanks underground ran empty. Road trips became impossible for ordinary families. Americans were told to prepare for a winter with insufficient fuel to heat their own homes, and President Nixon publicly ordered federal office buildings to lower their daytime temperatures to between 65 and 68 degrees, insisting the directive applied even to the very room where he was speaking. It was, by any measure, a national humiliation, a wealthy superpower suddenly forced to ration something it had always assumed was inexhaustible. That crisis is when the phrase energy independence entered the national conversation in earnest, alongside a painful reckoning with just how far the country was from achieving it. Nixon responded by banning oil exports outright and announcing an ambitious plan to build roughly 1,000 nuclear power plants by the year 2000, a plan intended to permanently reduce the nation's exposure to any single fuel source ever again. According to later estimates, if that plan had actually been carried out in full, the United States could have met double its entire 2022 energy demand using zero fossil fuel emissions from electricity generation. Instead, only about 54 plants were ever actually built, slowed by rising construction costs. Public skepticism following high-profile nuclear accidents elsewhere in the world, and a political appetite that simply faded once gas lines disappeared and memories grew short. Meanwhile, the country still needed enormous quantities of oil because internal combustion engines were not going to power themselves, and domestic wells simply could not supply enough of it on their own. Imports from Canada increased steadily, since Canada was a peaceful and reliable neighbor with growing production of its own. But the United States still leaned heavily on the same Middle Eastern nations that had just demonstrated how quickly that supply could vanish without warning. Slowly rising imports from Canada, heavy reliance on the nations that made up the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, and stagnant domestic output. That combination set the stage perfectly for a revolution nobody saw coming, least of all the oil companies themselves. If you looked at a graph of United States oil and natural gas production through this entire stretch, the line kept sliding downward decade after decade in a pattern that looked frankly terminal. It would be easy to assume that decline meant the country was simply running dry, exhausting a finite resource the way a bottle of water eventually empties. It was not. The United States had and still has enormous quantities of oil sitting underground, arguably more than most geologists in the 1970s would have dared to estimate. The real problem was never scarcity. The real problem was access, and access turned out to be an engineering puzzle rather than a geological dead end. Consider the Barnett Shale, a massive natural gas formation stretching across the region around Fort Worth, Texas. In 1995, the federal government confirmed the formation held an enormous volume of natural gas, but there was a catch. The gas was trapped in a form geologists call unconventional. There are two broad ways that oil and gas tend to exist underground: conventional and unconventional. Conventional deposits behave roughly like a giant underground puddle. You drill down, insert something resembling a straw, and the oil or gas flows upward on its own, or with minimal assistance from pumps. Saudi Arabia and much of the Middle East sit on enormous conventional reserves, which is precisely why their oil remains so inexpensive to extract, sometimes costing only a few dollars a barrel to bring to the surface. The Barnett Shale, by contrast, held its natural gas and oil trapped tightly inside dense rock formations called shale, locked away in pockets too small and too scattered for a simple straw to ever reach. Getting it out required breaking that rock apart entirely, a process known as hydraulic fracturing, or fracking for short. People had understood the basic concept of fracking for well over a century before it ever became commercially viable. In fact, John Wilkes Booth, roughly 1 month before assassinating Abraham Lincoln, had worked briefly as an oilman attempting exactly this kind of early fracturing technique in Pennsylvania. His attempt failed spectacularly. An explosive charge lowered into a well-produced, a massive hole and not a single drop of usable oil. Some historians have half-jokingly suggested that the financial devastation and frustration from that failure contributed to the anger that ultimately pushed Booth toward violence just weeks later, though that remains understandably a matter of historical speculation rather than settled fact. Fast forward more than a century, and a businessman named George Mitchell found himself facing a strikingly similar frustration. Documents showed his land sitting directly above the gas-rich Barnett Shale. Yet every attempt to extract it drained his finances without producing meaningful results, year after expensive year. In the late 1990s, Mitchell's team tried something different. Instead of the older fracturing techniques, they pumped in a specialized water-based mixture to crack the rock more effectively. And rather than drilling straight down, they angled the well sideways to access far more of the shale formation at once, a technique now known as horizontal drilling. That combination worked. Production surged, and it finally became fast and affordable enough to extract the vast resources locked inside American shale formations nationwide, not just in Texas, but eventually across North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania as well. For several years after that breakthrough, producers remained cautious, still skeptical that this new approach could scale profitably across an entire industry. Then, in 2008, oil prices spiked to record highs at the exact moment interest rates dropped to record lows, creating perfect financial conditions for a drilling boom fueled by cheap borrowed money. Between 2008 and 2018, the United States doubled its total oil production. In 2015, the long-standing ban on exporting American crude oil, in place since Nixon's era, was finally lifted. Fracking was not the only factor behind that dramatic increase in output, but it was overwhelmingly the primary driver, transforming sleepy rural counties into boom towns almost overnight. That explains how America ended up with a genuinely surprising abundance of oil, thanks almost entirely to this one technological breakthrough decades in the making. But something still does not add up. The United States now produces roughly the same amount of oil that Americans consume every year, and yet the country continues shipping enormous volumes of that oil overseas, only to import a comparable volume of different oil from other nations in return. There is a specific set of logistical and chemical reasons behind this seemingly strange international oil swap, and understanding it requires looking at the one remaining piece of the puzzle standing between crude in the ground and gasoline in a tank: refining. Before any crude oil from anywhere in the world can actually be used as fuel, it has to pass through a refinery. Left unrefined, crude oil is nothing more than a thick, toxic, tar-like sludge with essentially no practical use to anyone. Consider Chevron's El Segundo refinery, one of the largest oil processing facilities on the entire West Coast. Despite sitting inside the United States, most of the crude oil this facility processes is not American at all. Instead, it arrives aboard massive tanker ships anchored several miles offshore, with oil pumped ashore through long underwater pipelines connecting the ship directly to the refinery's storage tanks. In October of a recent year, the most current data available at the time, this single refinery received crude oil shipments from South Korea, Argentina, Guyana, Mexico, and Colombia, a genuinely global supply chain feeding one American facility. And El Segundo is far from unique. Another Chevron refinery in California imported crude from Iraq. A refinery in Mississippi brought in oil from Venezuela. Refineries in Michigan imported Canadian crude. And even Texas, the state responsible for drilling nearly half of all domestic crude oil, imported roughly 26 million barrels of foreign crude in that same single month, despite sitting on top of some of the richest oil fields in the entire country. As a quick point of reference, 1 barrel of oil equals 42 gallons, roughly the volume of a standard bathtub, which helps put that 26 million figure into slightly more human terms. Given how much domestic oil the United States already produces, this constant shuffling of crude across international borders seems needlessly complicated, almost wasteful on its face. So why does it happen? There are a few concrete reasons, and none of them involve simple incompetence or oversight. A significant share of American oil genuinely does stay within the country. Texas, for example, drills enormous volumes of crude and refines much of it just down the road, meaning transportation costs stay minimal, and Texans enjoy some of the lowest gasoline prices in the entire nation as a direct result. But the first real obstacle is geography. Not every oil field sits conveniently close to a refinery, and refineries are not always located near the populations that actually need the fuel. California offers a clear illustration of this problem. In a recent year, the state consumed roughly 65 million barrels of oil. California is itself one of the largest oil-producing states in the country, with active oil fields scattered throughout the region, including wells hidden discreetly within residential neighborhoods across Los Angeles, disguised behind fake office buildings and decorative walls so residents barely notice them. Yet all of California's own production still covers only about 1/5 of what the state actually needs, leaving a substantial gap that has to be filled from somewhere. The obvious solution might seem to be pulling in extra supply from Texas. Across most of the country, an extensive network of pipelines efficiently moves crude oil from production regions to the refineries and consumers who need it, crisscrossing the interior of the continent in a web most Americans never think about. California, however, is a striking exception. Despite having nearly 40 million residents, the state has no crude oil pipelines connecting it to the rest of the country's major production regions. And given the regulatory and political landscape, it likely never will. Even if Texas crude somehow reached California by other means, whether by rail or by ship, most of the refineries there could not actually process it efficiently. This turns out to be the single biggest reason the United States cannot simply rely entirely on its own domestic oil, and it has nothing to do with geology at all. Here's a simple way to picture the underlying issue, borrowed from an analogy popular on internet discussion forums built around explaining complex topics simply. Imagine there are two types of oil in the world. Call one strawberry and the other chocolate. For decades, the United States primarily produced chocolate oil, so refineries across the country were specifically engineered, at enormous expense, to process chocolate oil efficiently. But over time, especially after the fracking boom transformed domestic production, America's oil supply shifted dramatically toward the strawberry variety, a lighter, sweeter crude that behaves very differently once it enters a refinery. Existing chocolate refineries cannot easily process strawberry oil without running into serious operational problems, damaged equipment, reduced output, and higher maintenance costs. Refiners could, in theory, build entirely new facilities specifically designed for this newer type of American crude. But according to industry commentators, stringent environmental regulations combined with the broader national push away from fossil fuel infrastructure make that kind of massive capital investment extremely risky from a business standpoint, particularly when nobody can guarantee that demand for gasoline will still exist in the same volume 20 or 30 years from now. This helps explain why the most recent major oil refinery built entirely from scratch in the United States dates back nearly 50 years. Rather than undertaking the enormously expensive process of retrofitting American refineries to handle the newer domestic crude, energy companies made a more straightforward financial decision. Import the chocolate-style crude that foreign nations still produce and continue running existing American refineries exactly as designed, while exporting the surplus strawberry-style crude overseas to refineries elsewhere that are already equipped to process it efficiently. This single decision explains why, in a recent year, roughly 59% of the crude oil supplied to California refineries came from foreign countries, and why approximately 80% of the oil processed at the El Segundo refinery specifically originated outside the United States entirely. Despite exporting substantial volumes of its own crude, the country continues importing a significant amount as well, a two-way trade that looks contradictory until you understand the chemistry driving it. The real picture involves many more gradations of crude oil type than a simple two-flavor analogy can fully capture, and most refineries are engineered to handle a range of crude varieties rather than one single type exclusively. But the fundamental conclusion remains the same either way. Energy companies have determined that maintaining existing American refineries and importing the specific crude type those refineries were built to handle generates significantly more profit than overhauling the system to run entirely on domestic oil. That logistical reality leads directly into the final and most commonly misunderstood concern surrounding American oil: energy independence itself. As a concept, energy independence carries an enormous emotional appeal. It suggests complete control over one's own destiny, with no foreign nation holding leverage over something as essential as fuel. It sounds like the obviously correct national goal, since producing everything domestically should, in theory, make energy both closer and cheaper for everyone. In practice, that is often simply not how the underlying economics actually work, no matter how satisfying the slogan sounds on a campaign stage. Abruptly halting all oil imports and exports overnight would be extraordinarily disruptive to the American economy, far more disruptive than most political rhetoric ever acknowledges. Refineries throughout the Midwest, including major facilities around Chicago, would suddenly find themselves without the specific type of crude they are engineered to process, and untangling that mismatch would take years, possibly decades, to fully resolve through new construction and retooling. The single largest factor determining gasoline prices at the pump is the international price of crude oil, a truly global market the United States only partially influences despite its massive production volume, since prices are set by worldwide supply and demand, geopolitical tension, and decisions made in places like Vienna and Riyadh just as much as in Washington. And proximity alone does not guarantee usability, as the strawberry and chocolate analogy makes clear. Political rhetoric frequently blames whichever president happens to be in office for a supposed failure to achieve energy independence, but the honest reality is that the United States has never actually achieved full energy independence at any point in its modern history, and arguably never needed to in order to remain prosperous and secure. What every nation should genuinely prioritize instead is energy security, having reliable, sufficient access to meet the actual needs of its economy and its citizens, regardless of whether every single barrel originates domestically. The United States currently maintains solid energy security by that more accurate standard. That distinction, security over strict independence, explains why growing reliance on Canadian imports has made consistent strategic sense over recent decades. Historically speaking, the likelihood of the United States entering into serious conflict with Canada is dramatically lower than the likelihood of tension with nations across the Middle East, making Canadian crude a comparatively safe and dependable long-term bet regardless of which political party controls Washington. As for America's underlying dependence on oil itself, even as public pressure builds toward reducing fossil fuel consumption altogether, the country remains deeply reliant on oil for the foreseeable future, likely for at least another decade, and quite possibly well beyond it. Managing that transition responsibly requires balancing several genuinely competing priorities simultaneously: mitigating climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, limiting environmental harm in the communities closest to drilling and refining operations, and keeping energy genuinely affordable for the households that can least absorb sudden price increases at the pump or on their utility bill. If the United States continues drilling domestically rather than relying more heavily on imports, the world may see some modest benefit from America's comparatively lower greenhouse gas emissions during the extraction process itself, since domestic environmental standards tend to be stricter than those in many exporting nations. But ultimately, meaningfully reducing global emissions requires leaving a substantial share of that oil in the ground, rather than extracting and burning it at all. An uncomfortable truth that does not fit neatly into either side of the usual political argument. That does not mean abandoning fossil fuels overnight is realistic or achievable, given how deeply embedded oil remains in transportation, manufacturing, and daily life. But the transition toward cleaner energy can likely move considerably faster than much of the fossil fuel industry currently assumes or would prefer, if public policy and private investment genuinely align behind that goal. The oil beneath American soil was never really the problem. Getting it to the right refinery, in the right form, at the right price, that has always been the far more complicated story. And it is one that will keep shaping gas prices, foreign policy, and climate debates for years to come, regardless of how the next election turns out.